The village lay nestled between the dense green of ancient forests and the steady murmur of a river whose depths held whispered secrets. Mist curled over the water at dawn, vanishing as the sun rose to bathe the land in gold, but the villagers knew better than to dismiss the old stories. The river was alive, they said, a watcher, a keeper of justice. It had swallowed men whole and returned only their names to the wind. It had carried messages between the living and the dead. Aduni grew up listening to these tales from her mother, a woman of gentle hands and quiet wisdom, a healer who once belonged to a long line of herbalists. Her father had been a man of great knowledge, one who spoke to the plants and understood the whispers of the wind, but he had left the world too soon, and with him went the security Aduni once knew. Without him, she and her mother became vulnerable, and in a world where power dictated respect, vulnerability was a dangerous thing. Her mother remarried, not for love, but for survival. The man she wed was a wealthy trader, a man whose wealth spoke louder than his kindness. He was known for his sharp tongue and sharper fists, a man who believed power was best wielded through fear. His son, Kojo, had inherited not only his father's wealth but also his ruthlessness. Unlike his father, who at least carried the pretense of generosity in public, Kojo made no such effort. He saw Aduni and her mother as burdens, intruders in a home that should have belonged only to him. Kojo's resentment ran deep, like the roots of an ancient tree, twisting and gnarled with years of bitterness. He had always been the center of his father's world, the only child, the only heir, until Aduni and her mother arrived. He watched as his father's wealth now stretched to feed another mouth, another soul, and he despised it. Though Aduni never sought to challenge him, her very existence felt like an affront. Worse still was the way the villagers looked at her. Despite the hardship, Aduni carried herself with quiet dignity. She did not bow to Kojo's cruelty, nor did she let it break her. She found solace in the things her mother had taught her, the touch of leaves, the whispers of the earth, the way the river spoke if one listened long enough. She would disappear into the forests for hours, returning with herbs and roots, her hands stained with the earth's knowledge. But Kojo saw only defiance. It infuriated him that, even in suffering, Aduni held a strength he could never understand. She had nothing, yet she carried herself like she had the entire world in her hands. And that made him hate her even more. Kojo was not just cruel, he was reckless. His father's wealth had allowed him many indulgences, and among them was his greatest vice, gambling. He played with men who did not know mercy, with debts that did not disappear. He had lost more than he could afford, but his arrogance made him blind. Each time he lost, he thought only of how he would win it back. But winning never came. His father had grown tired of paying off his mistakes, and the warnings had begun. You are not a child anymore, Kojo. The next time, you will find your own way out. For the first time, Kojo felt the walls closing in on him. The debtors would not wait forever. If he could not pay with money, they would take something else. He saw the way they looked at him, how their smiles no longer reached their eyes. He had seen what happened to men who could not pay their debts, how they disappeared into the night and were never seen again. Desperation made him cunning. Kojo began to see Aduni not as a person, not as an inconvenience, but as an opportunity. A way out. She had always been an outsider in his home, and to him, that meant she belonged to no one. And things that belonged to no one could be sold. A plan began to form in his mind, one that sent a thrill through him. He would rid himself of Aduni, rid himself of the shadow she cast over him, and in doing so, buy his way back to freedom. Fate, however, was already watching. The river had listened. The forest had heard. And the world was waiting. The night hung heavy over the village, thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant murmur of the river. The air carried an eerie stillness, the kind that made even the crickets hesitate in their songs. Beneath the shelter of a thatched rooftop in the village's hidden corner, Kojo crouched in the shadows, his ears straining to catch the murmured conversation of men he had been warned to avoid. The traders were not like the simple merchants who passed through the village by day. These men carried the scent of blood and desperation, their eyes sharp, their laughter hollow. They spoke in hushed voices, but the weight of their words was unmistakable. They were seeking something. No, not something, someone. Young, one of them muttered, his voice rough as dried bark. Untouched. The buyer pays well for girls who haven't yet been claimed. Kojo's heart pounded in his chest. Gold. More than he had ever touched. The weight of his own failures pressed upon him like a stone, his debts a noose tightening around his throat. The men he owed were not patient, and they were not merciful. This was a chance, no, a gift. He stepped forward from the shadows, his voice measured but firm. I have someone. The men turned, their eyes flickering with interest. One of them, a man with a jagged scar cutting through his cheek, studied Kojo carefully. Your own? A stepsister. He spat the word like it was filth on his tongue. She does not belong to me. She will not be missed. The traders exchanged glances before the scarred man gave a slow nod. Bring her to us. The river's edge. Midnight. Kojo did not hesitate. And my payment? The scarred man grinned, tossing a small leather pouch toward him. Kojo caught it, feeling the weight of gold. A mere fraction of what was promised. Half now. The rest when the girl is ours. Kojo clenched the pouch in his fist. It was done. When the time came, he found Aduni sitting by the fire in their courtyard, staring into the flames. There was a quiet strength in her posture, a serenity that made something stir inside him, something he refused to acknowledge. He forced himself to focus. I have something to tell you, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Something important. She did not turn immediately. Then speak. Kojo stepped closer, lowering his voice as if revealing a great secret. There is an elder, deep in the forest, one who knows things others do not. He has sent for you. Aduni finally looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. Why? Kojo forced a casual shrug. He says he has seen your destiny. That he alone can reveal what awaits you. The firelight cast flickering shadows across her face. She was cautious, she had always been, but curiosity was a powerful thing. Kojo had seen it before, the way she longed for answers, the way she clung to the fragments of wisdom their mother had passed down. After a long pause, she nodded. Take me to him. They left the village in silence, their steps swallowed by the thick darkness of the forest. The air was alive with the sounds of night creatures, the whisper of leaves shifting in the unseen wind. Aduni moved with practiced ease, but Kojo could feel his own pulse hammering in his ears. The traders would be waiting. The journey was longer than it should have been, Kojo's doing. He wanted to make sure no one would hear her scream. When they finally arrived at the meeting place, the river glowed faintly beneath the moon's watchful gaze. The traders emerged from the shadows, their presence colder than the night air. Aduni stiffened. She turned to Kojo, her eyes narrowing. Where is the elder? Kojo did not answer. The scarred man stepped forward, his grin sharp and gleaming in the moonlight. Welcome, girl. Realization struck her like a blow, the air leaving her lungs in a rush. She took a step back, then another. No, she whispered, shaking her head. Kojo, what have you done? But Kojo did not meet her gaze. He stared at the river instead, at the silver ripples moving against the shore, as if refusing to see what he had become. The traders moved swiftly. Rough hands grabbed Aduni, binding her wrists before she could fight. She struggled, her voice rising in anger, in fear, in betrayal. Kojo! You cannot do this. Please! Still, he would not look at her. The scarred man tossed another pouch at his feet. He caught it, his fingers closing around the weight of his sins. Aduni's voice trembled, her breath uneven as they dragged her away. The spirits see you, Kojo. The river listens. The forest remembers. A shiver ran through him, but he crushed it beneath the weight of gold. As the traders disappeared into the night, silence settled over the forest, thick and suffocating. The wind shifted, carrying the soft rustling of unseen watchers, whispering words that did not belong to the living. Kojo turned to leave, but the river let out a low, mournful sound. A ripple spread across its surface, though nothing had touched it. A warning. Fate had seen. And fate was not kind. The night stretched endlessly as Aduni sat hunched in the back of the wooden cart, her wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into her skin. The steady creak of the wheels against the rough earth filled the silence, broken only by the occasional murmurs of the other captives. The air was thick with dust, clinging to her skin, her throat dry from hours without water. Shadows stretched across the landscape, swallowing the distant trees as they moved farther from everything she had ever known. The traders spoke little, their voices hushed, their laughter hollow. They had done this before, many times. Their hands were steady, their faces indifferent. To them, she was nothing more than a body to be sold, another coin to be pocketed. Among the captives, Aduni was the youngest. The others bore the weight of their suffering in their eyes, their shoulders hunched with unspoken grief. One girl, no older than 16, whispered prayers under her breath, her fingers trembling as she clutched a small pendant hidden in the folds of her dress. Another, a woman with deep scars across her arms, sat with her head bowed, silent and unmoving. As the cart rumbled forward, the wind shifted. A strange sound wove through the air, not the rustling of leaves, nor the calls of night creatures, but something older, something deeper. It was a whisper, too soft to be words, yet it carried weight, curling around Aduni like an unseen presence. She lifted her head, searching the darkened sky. A lone hawk circled above them, its wings stretched wide, gliding soundlessly through the night. One of the traders noticed it too. "That bird has been following us since dawn," he muttered to his companion. The other scoffed. "It's a bird. What of it?" The first man frowned but said nothing more. The wind shifted again. Hours passed, the journey unbroken except for the occasional stop when the traders took water from their flasks. They did not offer any to the captives. Aduni's throat burned, her lips cracked from dryness, but she refused to ask. Then something strange happened. One of the traders lifted his flask to drink, but the moment the water touched his lips, he gagged, coughing violently. He threw the flask to the ground, his face twisted in disgust. "What is it?" another asked. "The water," the man wiped his mouth. "It tastes like ash." A second trader checked his own flask, taking a cautious sip. He cursed, throwing it aside. "Mine too." A murmur ran through the group. The traders checked their remaining water supply, only to find the vessels had dried. Panic flickered in their eyes, but they quickly buried it beneath anger. Someone tampered with it, one of them accused, his gaze landing on the captives. The scarred man, their leader, stepped forward, his voice steady. "No one touched the water," he said. "Keep moving." Aduni did not speak, but she knew. This was no trick of man. By the next morning, exhaustion settled deep in her bones. The captives had been allowed a few sips of water from a fresh stream they passed, but it did little to soothe their suffering. The desert loomed ahead, a vast stretch of endless sand, and Aduni knew that the worst was yet to come. As the traders prepared for the journey, an old woman beside her turned, her eyes dark and knowing. "You are not meant to be here," she whispered. Aduni met her gaze, something cold curling in her stomach. "What do you mean?" The woman's lips barely moved as she spoke. "The spirits watch over you. They have not abandoned you." Aduni swallowed, her heartbeat quickening. Before she could say more, the traders barked orders, forcing them to their feet. The march continued, each step a battle against the unforgiving sun. By midday, the hawk was still there. Watching. Waiting. Kojo walked through the village with his head held high, the weight of the gold pouch pressing against his side, a constant reminder of his newfound status. He had never known such wealth, never felt the power that came with the clinking of gold between his fingers. For the first time in his life, he was no longer the desperate son of a ruthless trader, he was a man of fortune. The village took notice. Men who once scoffed at his reckless ways now nodded in respect when he passed. Women who had ignored him before now cast lingering glances his way. And then there were his new companions, Men who laughed at his jokes, clapped him on the back, and drank with him deep into the night. Kojo bathed in their attention, mistaking it for loyalty. He threw coins at anything that pleased him, fine clothes, strong palm wine, grand feasts. He wanted the village to see him, to recognize his worth. And they did. For a time. But as the days passed, something shifted. The first sign came subtly. His pouch of gold, once heavy, now felt suspiciously light. He frowned, shaking it, counting the coins again and again. He had spent much, yes, but not enough for such a drastic loss. It must have been his imagination. The second sign was harder to ignore. One afternoon, as he leaned over the village well to splash water on his face, he caught sight of his reflection, and his breath caught. The water rippled unnaturally, though there was no wind. His face wavered, stretching into something unrecognizable, something wrong. For a brief moment, it was as if another face lurked beneath his own, a shadow, a whisper of something unseen. He stumbled back, his pulse hammering. Just the water, he muttered to himself. A trick of the light. Yet, that night, his dreams twisted into something far worse. He wandered through a vast darkness, an emptiness that stretched forever. And then, from the shadows, a voice called his name. Kojo. It was not the voice of any man. It was soft yet sharp, as if woven from silk and blades. He turned, but there was nothing. Then she appeared. A woman stood before him, faceless, her form shifting like smoke. Her presence pressed against him, heavy as the weight of his guilt. "You have been seen," she whispered. Kojo gasped awake, drenched in sweat. Misfortune did not wait long to strike. His father, once a man of unshakable strength, fell ill without warning. He withered before Kojo's eyes, his skin growing pale, his voice weak. The village healers could find no cause, no cure. "The spirits are restless," one elder murmured as he left their home, shaking his head. Kojo clenched his fists. He would not listen to the foolish superstitions of old men. But the whispers grew. The river ran murky, thick with an unnatural stillness. The crops withered before they could bear fruit. A sickness crept through the village, slow but unrelenting. And then, one by one, Kojo's new friends began to vanish. At first, they offered excuses. They were busy. They had obligations. Soon, they stopped visiting altogether. The feasts grew smaller, the laughter quieter. His gold could no longer summon them. Kojo was alone. And the faceless woman still called his name. The journey stretched endlessly, the land shifting from burning sands to jagged hills, from desolate plains to a world wrapped in shadow. The air grew heavy, thick with something unseen, something ancient. Aduni, weary beyond words, felt the change long before she saw it, the creeping presence of a place untouched by light. And then, beyond the last ridge, the kingdom revealed itself. It was unlike anything she had imagined. The sky, though clear, never truly brightened, as if the sun itself hesitated to shine upon this place. Towers of black stone loomed in the distance, sharp and jagged like the teeth of a great beast. A vast fortress rose at the heart of it all, its walls covered in creeping vines that pulsed as if alive. Fires burned in iron sconces, yet their flames flickered unnaturally, casting shadows where there should have been none. The captives were led through the massive gates, their chains rattling against the cold stone beneath their feet. The people who lined the streets to watch were not ordinary subjects. Their eyes were too sharp, their whispers too knowing, their faces marked with symbols that seemed to shift under the dim light. The traders, their business done, bowed low before a hooded figure waiting at the entrance of the fortress. "Your offerings, as promised," the lead trader said, his voice tinged with something close to fear. The hooded man stepped forward, his robe trailing behind him. He moved with a quiet authority, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. His gaze swept over the captives, lingering on some, dismissing others. When his eyes landed on Aduni, he paused. Something flickered across his face, recognition, or perhaps something deeper. "You," he said, his voice like rustling parchment. "Step forward." Aduni hesitated but knew refusal was not an option. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with silent defiance. The hooded man studied her for a long moment before turning to the traders. The others will serve as needed. But this one. He gestured to Aduni. She is not to be touched. She will be taken to the palace. Murmurs spread among the captives, but the traders did not question him. They had delivered their goods, and that was all that mattered. As Aduni was pulled from the group, uncertainty gripped her. This was different. This was not the fate she had prepared herself for. She was led through the vast halls of the palace, where the air was thick with incense and secrets. The walls seemed to whisper as she passed, voices too faint to be real yet impossible to ignore. She was taken to a chamber unlike the others, richly furnished but windowless, as if meant to keep something in rather than provide comfort. A servant bowed deeply before her, never meeting her gaze. "You are an honored guest," he murmured. "But you may not leave." Aduni said nothing. That night, she did not sleep. Instead, she lay awake, listening to the voices that curled through the air, slipping through the cracks of the stone walls like mist. They spoke in a tongue older than the earth, but she understood them all the same. She has come. The prophecy stirs. The Shadow King watches. And beyond the veils of the great hall, hidden from sight, he did. Kojo sat in the dimly lit hut, his hands trembling as he poured the last of his coins into a desperate offering before the village diviner. The man had been summoned by the elders, his presence heavy with the weight of something ancient, something beyond mortal hands. The diviner did not touch the gold. He did not even look at it. Instead, he gazed into the flames of the small fire before him, his eyes distant, as if seeing far beyond what lay before him. Kojo swallowed, his throat dry. "Tell me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is happening to me?" The diviner's lips barely moved as he spoke. "You have sold your own blood. Fate is coming for you." The words were like ice in Kojo's veins. For weeks, the nightmares had plagued him. His father's breath grew weaker with each passing day, his once mighty hands reduced to frail shadows of themselves. The village, once bustling with laughter and music, had grown quieter, as if even the earth itself recoiled from him. His so-called friends no longer spoke his name, and worst of all, when he looked into water, there was nothing. No reflection. No proof of his existence. His hands balled into fists. "Tell me how to stop it," he demanded. The diviner did not answer. He merely lifted a single finger and pointed. Kojo followed the direction, his heart hammering. The elders had remained silent this whole time, their gazes heavy with judgment. Now, one of them spoke. "You must find her," the old woman murmured, her voice like wind through brittle leaves. "Aduni must return to her rightful place. Only then will fate loosen its grip on you." Kojo's breath caught in his throat. Aduni. He had thought himself rid of her, thought that the deal had been sealed the night he led her into the forest. Yet now, it was as if the very world whispered her name, as if she had become something more than the girl he had cast away. "You mean," he licked his lips. "She's alive?" The old woman's face remained impassive. "She is where you cannot reach her," she said. "Unless you are willing to bleed for your redemption." Kojo stood quickly, his mind racing. "Tell me where." The elders said nothing more. It was the diviner who finally turned to face him, his gaze dark, unreadable. "The forest knows what you did," he said. "It will not make your journey easy." Kojo left at dawn, the weight of fear pressing against him with every step. The forest loomed ahead, the very place where he had betrayed Aduni. Now, it waited for him. The moment he stepped beneath its canopy, the air thickened, the world shifting around him. The trees, once ordinary, seemed taller, their branches twisted into shapes that resembled clawed hands reaching for him. Shadows flickered where there should have been none. He pressed forward, determined. By nightfall, the forest had swallowed the light entirely, and the true torment began. The first night, he woke to the sound of whispers. Soft at first, then growing louder, circling him like unseen specters. When he turned, there was nothing, only the trees, their bark etched with patterns that looked too much like eyes. The second night, the illusions came. He saw her, Aduni, standing in the distance, her back turned. Relief and terror warred within him as he stumbled toward her. "Aduni," he called. She turned, and his blood ran cold. Her face was smooth, too smooth. No features, no eyes, no mouth. Just a blank void where her expression should have been. "You sold me," the faceless figure whispered, though its lips did not move. Kojo fell backward, scrambling away. "You sold me," the voice repeated, echoing through the trees. He squeezed his eyes shut. No. No, this isn't real. But the forest did not care for his denial. The third night, the spirits came. They did not whisper. They did not trick his mind with illusions. They simply stood in the distance, unmoving figures wrapped in mist, watching. Waiting. Kojo did not sleep that night. By the time he reached the other side of the forest, he was no longer the same man who had entered. His clothes were torn, his body weakened, his mind haunted by things he could not explain. But he had survived. And he would not stop until he found Aduni. Aduni sat in the vast chamber, the air thick with the scent of burning herbs and something older, something woven into the very bones of the palace. The Shadow King's advisor, a man whose name no one spoke, had summoned her at dawn, leading her through winding halls where the torches burned with a cold, blue flame. She had been in the palace long enough to understand its rules. Nothing was what it seemed, and no question had a simple answer. The advisor, his robe embroidered with symbols that shimmered in the dim light, stood before her now. "Do you know why you are here?" Aduni lifted her chin. "Because I was taken." The man did not smile, but there was something like amusement in his ancient eyes. "No," he said softly. "Because you were always meant to be." A flick of his hand, and the room darkened. The walls shifted, as if the very palace itself listened. Then, shadows moved, pulling away from the corners like living things. They twisted and curled, forming shapes, images that flickered in and out of sight. A story unfolded before her. Long ago, before the kingdom was swallowed by darkness, it had been a place of great power, ruled by a prince whose heart was untainted by greed or cruelty. But power is a dangerous thing, and those who crave it will stop at nothing to take it. A woman, one whose name was lost to time, sought to bind the kingdom to her will. She cursed the prince, twisting his form, binding him to shadows, ensuring that no light would ever touch him again. The land itself withered, the people forced into silence, their voices swallowed by the very curse that held their king captive. Only one thing could break it. The blood of an ancient line. A daughter of fate. Aduni's breath caught. She tore her gaze from the swirling shadows, her pulse hammering. "You're saying?" The advisor nodded. "You are of that bloodline." The words felt too heavy, too impossible. "No," she whispered. "My father was a herbalist." "My mother." "Your mother knew the truth." The advisor's voice was calm, but it left no room for doubt. "She hid you, hoping fate would never come knocking." Aduni's hands clenched. This could not be true. And yet, deep inside, something in her stirred. A knowing she had never dared to name. A slow movement in the darkness drew her attention. She had never seen the Shadow King's face. He was always hidden, veiled by mist and shadow. But now, he stepped forward, the darkness peeling away just enough to reveal the glint of his eyes, golden, like fire trapped beneath ice. "You have a choice," he said, his voice deeper than the wind before a storm. "Embrace what you were meant to be. Free this land from its curse. Or walk away, and remain forever bound by the chains of fate." The air between them crackled with something unseen. Aduni wanted to deny it. To say she was nothing more than a girl taken against her will, a victim of cruelty. But something inside her whispered otherwise. She was not powerless. She had never been. Her mind swam with questions, but one burned brighter than the rest. "I want to see him," she said. "The one who betrayed me." The Shadow King was silent for a long moment. Then, he nodded. "Your fates are tied," he said. "Let us see if he is worthy of redemption." Kojo stumbled through the gates of the Shadow Kingdom, his body broken by the journey, his mind frayed by the horrors he had faced. He had lost everything, his wealth, his pride, his sense of control. Now, the only thing that remained was the desperate hope that he could undo what had been set in motion. The palace loomed before him, its walls pulsing with an energy that made his skin crawl. He felt the weight of unseen eyes watching, judging. The air was thick with something old, something that whispered his name in a voice he could not recognize. A group of figures awaited him at the entrance, standing in silence. And at their center, Aduni. Kojo's breath hitched. She was not the girl he had left in the forest. She stood tall, draped in garments that shimmered like the night sky, her presence commanding. The torches cast an ethereal glow around her, but she needed no fire to burn. There was power in her stance, in the unwavering way she looked at him. For the first time in his life, Kojo felt small. He fell to his knees. "Aduni. Do not speak my name," she said. The weight of her words crushed the breath from his lungs. "You sold me," she continued, her voice steady, free of anger but filled with something far heavier, certainty. "You did not think of what would become of me. You did not care. And now you stand before me, not because you are sorry, but because you fear what awaits you." Kojo's lips trembled. You have no words that can change what was done." Silence fell over the courtyard. The wind shifted, carrying with it something more than air, something ancient, something watching. And then, the ground trembled. The shadows lengthened, stretching toward Kojo like grasping hands. The torches flickered wildly, their flames twisting into unnatural shapes. A low murmur rippled through the air, voices rising from the earth itself. "Fate will decide." Kojo gasped as the darkness surged toward him, wrapping around his limbs like living vines. He thrashed, but there was no escaping it. The spirits had spoken. The air around him turned cold as the voice of the Shadow King echoed through the space. "You sought power without understanding its cost. Now, you will serve that which you tried to destroy." Kojo's body stiffened. His eyes widened as the shadows swallowed him, their tendrils creeping up his arms, his neck, seeping into his skin. His screams faded into the night as the darkness consumed him. When it receded, he was gone. No longer a man. No longer free. The spirits had bound him to the kingdom, to guard it, to protect it, to serve the very land he had once betrayed. Aduni exhaled, her gaze lingering on the spot where he had stood. There was no satisfaction in watching his fate unfold, only a quiet understanding that justice had been served. She turned, the weight of her destiny fully upon her now. The people of the Shadow Kingdom knelt as she passed, their whispers carrying her name like a hymn. Aduni, the daughter of fate. Aduni, the one who broke the curse. Aduni, the queen. And as she stepped into the palace, the shadows bowed to her will.